Hi, everyone. I'm Gia, and I'm here today with Sean Patton, who is the owner of Stocking Savvy, an environmental consulting company. Today, Sean will be presenting on aquatic butterfly gardens. So, Sean's company, Stocking Savvy, just to tell you a little bit about him and his background, his company was founded in 2018. It's a small environmental consulting business. It provides services all over Florida. The company uses biological systems, native plant species, harvesting, and a coalition of green businesses to restore habitat across Florida. Sean has his degree from New College of Florida in marine biology and is the co-coordinator of the EcoFlora Project, which is hosted by Selby Botanical Gardens. And this project documents the diversity and distribution of plants in Sarasota and Manatee Counties. Sean and I we share a common love for wetlands. And the first time I met him, it was through a mutual friend, where our plan was to wade waist deep in scary lake water in order to collect American lotus pods, which we did. And then afterwards, he gave my son and I a really cool explanation of how bladderwort plants trap their prey. He's really a passionate expert in his field, and I'm really looking forward to this presentation today. Everybody who's watching, just so you know, we can take your questions live. However, there's certain parts in the presentation that we will get to them. So if we don't get to your questions right away, just know that it's coming. But please feel free to go ahead and use the chats and wherever you're watching, YouTube or Facebook, and ask your questions, and we will get to them at certain points in the presentation, okay? So Sean, I hope I didn't leave anything out of my introduction. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to say, if you'd like to get started.
No, and actually two things. One, those American lotus seeds are now part of a research project that we're doing to introduce new plants to the native plant trade that have either fallen out of cultivation or have never been cultivated. Another one that we're working on are the bog spider orchid. So there's some really cool wetland stuff, and our goal is to eventually fight red tide, climate change, and the loss of biodiversity through large-scale ecosystem restoration. And we planted hundreds of thousands of plants, stocked tens of thousands of fish, and helped work with 4 baby orphan river otters, which was utterly adorable. We got all sorts of stuff, and I hope you all are ready for an unbelievably large amount of bad marine biology puns and some wonderful plant and aquatic facts. The first half of this presentation is going to be more focused on just aquatic gardening in general to kind of get our feet wet. And the last half is going to be specifics on some of the best plants to use. So there's going to be a midpoint where we can answer questions, but I just want everyone to kind of know where we're going to be at. And every single plant we're going to talk about is native to Florida and helps butterflies or other organisms in some direct way, with emphasis on pollinator and host plants. So this is going to be a very showy presentation, and we're going to get into the mud now. All right. So
Very
aquatic.
cool. All right, I'll go ahead and open up this presentation. I'm sorry, one moment. I see some people already commenting through Facebook. So through our StreamYard interface here, if you don't give StreamYard permission to see your name, all I see is Facebook user, and I don't know who you are. So if we don't get to your question during the live stream, I want to make sure that we can get back to you, but I can't if I don't know who you are. So if you can give permission for StreamYard to see your name, that would be fantastic. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and bring up Sean's presentation. We'll get going.
Hoorah. All right. So this is aquatic butterfly gardens and pondside living. And what is the goal of this? To create a healthy ecosystem for butterflies and other aquatic organisms. And as you can see here, every one of these is an aquatic butterfly, moth, or host plant. On the left right here, we have a beautiful white morph pickerel weed. They usually have purple flowers, but you also can see this rare white morph. This is a queen butterfly from one of our floating butterfly garden projects where you put a floating wetland in the middle of a lake to reduce nutrient pollution. And we'll get some pictures of those islands later. This is just one of my favorite wetland moths. It's a plume moth. These guys eat blue flag irises, and they're just very interesting, very delicate and T-shaped. And of course, wouldn't be a butterfly talk without the monarch butterfly. So I had to throw one of them in there. So to start off, all butterflies need 2 main plants, host plants and pollinator plants. Host plants are basically something that is eaten by the larvae of moths or butterflies, and most are generally restricted to 1 to 3 host species per like genus or family. So like, for example, all milkweeds or Asclepidaceae are eaten by monarch, queen, and soldier butterflies. And they also have the 2 longhorn beetles that prefer them as well. So if you don't have a milkweed species in your wetland, you miss out on those 5 species permanently. There are a few butterflies and moths that are generalist herbivores, but they're generalists, so we don't need to really focus on how to attract them. Like, for example, the big Luna moths eat a lot of things in the hackberry family and some of their allies. Pollinator plants are a little bit more general, and you generally always want to use native nectar sources. These tend to be preferred by pollinators, and a lot of non-native nectar plants just don't attract many pollinators. A great example of this that I'd have to say would be like some of the jatropha's, where you just don't see a lot of insects using them at all. And a lot of plants can be both host and pollinator. So milkweeds tend to be seasonal pollinators and are year-round hosts in some species. The aquatic milkweed to the left is a year-round native milkweed. In fact, the only one that grows year-round native to Florida. And then, of course, flower size and shape can affect the pollinators attracted. So this is where we start to get into the main areas of wetlands. Most people are familiar with the uplands. This is where we live most of the time. And this is where most people are most comfortable growing plants. This is an area that's always above the high water mark, might be moist or have a little bit of wet feet, but generally is well enough draining. You'll see things like maples, cypresses, oaks, Indian grasses, goldenrods, a lot of different plants up here. We're focusing mostly from riparian to littoral, and upland plants are important to help reduce erosion into this. Most lakes you'll see in Florida have a sharp decline right here, and they go straight from upland to littoral. This is bad. You need to have this gentle slope, because this gentle slope is where most of our wetland species live. In fact, the biggest limiting factor for wetland plants is the depth of water. It's not light, actually, though a lot of them prefer full sun. It's not nutrients, because the water brings most of their nutrients, and it's obviously not water because they like a lot of water. You can't really mold out most wetland species. They are used to having tons of water. It's the depth of water that's the limiting factor. And you can see that there's dozens of different beautiful species, from rudbeckias and liatris and cardinal flowers to a lot of the juncus reeds, spider lilies, swamp sunflowers, several different grass species, elderberry, which is a great native and edible plant, and the riparian area is definitely the showiest. Lizard's tail is actually a really cool shade-loving water plant that can grow in several inches of water. And look at this. The high water mark extends and usually covers the riparian section, but most of the time the riparian is just wet. Emergent is always inundated in a little bit of water, but might dry out during the dry season. And then the littoral is always wet. If the littoral area dries out, it's probably not a good littoral area. And I know a lot of people hear littoral shelf. There's no common mention of what a littoral shelf is. I've seen littoral shelves 10 feet deep. I've seen littoral shelves that dry out most of the year. So in my opinion, I like to go through most emergent zones in a pond are actually littoral shelves, where an area left shallower for plants to grow. But by definition, they tend to be deeper. So just keep that in mind, that a littoral shelf is just a shallow area for plants to grow, even though the littoral zone tends to be much deeper. So some best management practices for stormwater ponds. You want low-grade slopes into the pond, and you want a deep central pool for fish and for wildlife to survive, especially in dry seasons. And you want to keep mostly herbaceous plants, so no trees near these outfall structures. Most lakes and ponds have an outfall or areas where water leaves the pond. This is a standard stormwater pond, so I wanted to use it as an example. Wood can interfere with the stormwater flow. There we go. You also want a diversity of native species, not just plants, but fish, invertebrates, and other organisms, because a lot of these plants rely on those invertebrates for aerating the soil, cleaning the water, and fish help eat a lot of the pests of the roots. You also want regular maintenance of invasives. I believe it's the #1 invasive species in the world is water hyacinth, and many of the top 10 most invasive species are aquatic plants. So you want to just keep invasive species out of your lakes. If you think they're bad to control in your yard, like Brazilian pepper, which is also a riparian invasive species, they'll definitely grow very well in your lakes. So keep them out, and you want to reduce herbicides, pesticides, and fertilizers. Fertilizers cause algae blooms, and pesticides and herbicides kill your plants and your butterflies. So that should be a no-brainer. Some of the challenges for aquatic gardening, and this is something I think is really funny. I've had more plants fail due to turtles than fluctuating water levels. Turtles are big herbivores, and that's why when you want to plant a pond or plant an area of shoreline, you want to do a bunch of plants. The goal of aquatic gardening is not so much fertilizing. It's not so much pruning. It's keeping the starting plants to get big enough that they self-grow. A lot of plants have strong rhizomal growth. So you want to keep track of, are you planting the plant too deep? Most aquatic plants can go shallower, but not deeper. You want to keep in mind of fluctuating water levels. If you have water levels that change 20, 30 feet, you might, which I have seen in some lakes, it's going to limit what you can plant. And you might want to think about plants that are good for those ecosystems, like cypress trees. Soil types and sedimentation aren't as important. A lot of these aquatic plants just want the water, and some of them will even grow free floating if they don't like the sediment. Pickerel weed's a good example of that. Duck potato will also do that too. So bear in mind that the soil type isn't as important, but do watch for salinity. Algae and aquatic weed growth is huge. Never, ever fertilize your ponds. This is bad. If you think that there might be a nutrient deficiency, that I've actually never seen real nutrient deficiencies in water. They just get the nutrients they need from the water flowing by or the soil. So you never ever want to fertilize because that will lead to algae or overgrowth. Aquatic herbivores like turtles can be an issue, but this is why you want to plant multiple plants at once or use poisonous plants like milkweed, arrowrum, or other plants that are resistant to some of the bigger herbivores. And of course, if the butterflies are eating your plants, that's fine. And water quality. We want good water quality. It improves our lives, our health. It is good for the habitat, and plants will help contribute to that. Ebb and flow, yeah. So a lot of these areas have natural rises and falls, and this pickerel weed is currently growing on land. The big takeaway from this is to always, don't be afraid to plant shallower and let the plants grow deeper. They will always survive in shallower environments, with the exception of lily pads, which they like to be deep. Most lily pads prefer 6 inches to 8 feet of water. So they won't always grow out to the center of your lakes if you're concerned about that. Most lily pads have a max depth, which is between 6 and 13 feet. Only plant native. For every invasive species, there's a native lookalike. If you really like the look of water hyacinth, try pickerel weed. They're closely related and both have beautiful purple flowers. Aquatic plants tend to be faster spreading and more difficult to control. In fact, it was water hyacinth that led to the production of Agent Orange, not the Vietnam War. It was used in the Vietnam War because we had it to destroy rainforest, but it was originally made to kill this plant because it blocked entire rivers, lakes, and shut down shipping, and actually killed quite a few people when medical boats couldn't move by. So this is #1 invasive. Do not use this in your water body. It will take over. But when using native plants and native gardening techniques, you can filter out nutrients and help shade out the algae. These are pictures of 2 different kinds of algae blooms. The one on the left is the big mat-forming algae that can smother your plants. And the one on the right is actually a visible toxic algae bloom. It's kind of a bluish color. You'll know if it's a harmful algae bloom by the smell. Usually it'll smell like death or decay, or you'll see dead fish. Stay out of the water. These mat-forming ones, actually, though, can be raked out or harvested, and they're pure nutrients. Use them as fertilizer elsewhere. They're very, very high in nutrients and useful to mix in with compost. And you can also store a lot of these algae into plants, fish, and filter feeders. So the whole goal of aquatic gardening is kind of this interplay between plants and fish and invertebrates. It's not so much keeping things alive as reducing growth, which is why a lot of this gets thrown on its head. So we really want to keep water quality good. We want to keep the water nice and clear, or have tannins in the water from trees. That's a natural kind of pond dye that can help reduce plant growth. And having a lot of these plants will help reduce pollutants, oils, and runoff. Many of you might have heard of bioswales, and a lot of them incorporate semi-aquatic riparian plants. And this is something my company uses, which is multimodal biological control. It's basically using complementary native species to reduce nuisance species. So like say you have a bunch of midge flies. Well, you have dragonflies eat them in the air, and you have multiple fish species eat them in the water, and you can even target specialists like the red-breasted sunfish, which will eat midge flies before anything else in the water. And you can do the same thing for algae and aquatic macrophytes. And this also can act as a preventative measure. Herbicides will kill the plant, release the nutrients, or kill the algae and release the nutrients, where they then regrow, or worse, wash out into our bays and estuaries and help contribute to red tide or dead zones. By locking these nutrients into beneficial plants, aquatic gardens, and fish, you can actually help fight red tide. And the more you do this, and especially the farther upstream you are, the more people you benefit downstream. I've actually been able to help fix entire local watersheds. Oh, shoot. Someone is calling me. All right. Sorry about that. Gia, can you still, do you hear a beeping?
Yeah, I hear it.
Okay, here, I'm going to just mute my, all right. There we go. Sorry about that, folks. So by targeting plant growth or insect activity everywhere in the pond using multiple forms of controls, you can actually get more effective maintenance. And this even goes for mosquitoes as well. You can have multiple predators and herbivores of mosquitoes. And some of these aquatic herbivores can range wildly. So this is a golden shiner. It's a really good detritivore, helps eat the muck on the bottom of ponds, will eat some algae and midgefly larvae as well. It's one of the more common things I stock. And the goal is to eat algae, clean up the bottom, and there's tons of different things. And a lot of these can be anything from fish, mollusks, snails, small aquatic invertebrates like copepods and turtles, to even terrestrial ones. A lot of birds eat plant seeds, and some even eat aquatic weeds like gallinules, butterflies, and moths, the focus of this talk, and some mammals as well, like nutria or cows even. And if you have too few plants and too many herbivores, it can be bad for the plantings. But if you have too few herbivores and too many plants, especially invasives, that's an issue too. You want this nice checks and balances. Oh, and several aquatic plants like pickerel weed can sometimes be vulnerable to disease or herbivory. And so having a diverse planting community can help buffer against that. So even if one plant loses 90% of its population, the other ones can help fill in. And these are some example animals. Like cooter turtles are good to have because they eat a lot of algae, and they'll eat a few of your beneficials too, but that's fine. The lake chubsucker, funny name, I know, is a great detritivore, very similar to the golden shiner, and they're good just all-around cleaner fish. There are several shellfish that we're working on with FWC to eventually be able to stock into ponds, and that's a good filter feeder. Though in large enough lakes there are filter feeding fish we can stock as well. And then this is golden top minnow. They're great mosquito eaters. We have over 50 species actually by this point. And the Florida flagfish is the flagfish of my operation, which looks like a tiny American flag and eats a lot of the filamentous forming algae, and is a small schooling fish that can help move algae up the food chain. There's a great quote by Shapiro that says for every kilogram of top predators in birds, gators, and big animals, that implies 1 metric ton of algae removed up into the system. So you really want to have a lot of these organisms. Oh, and this is something I was talking about earlier. Well, Gia mentioned earlier in my intro. I work with the iNaturalist app and the Sarasota and Manatee EcoFlora Project. If you're down our way, we do monthly bio blitzes, but the app can be used anywhere. And it's helped us ID a lot of native plants, a lot of invasive species, including an aquatic one, Bacopa repens. And actually a week ago, we found the Solanum nightshade. So it's a invasive aquatic nightshade. So this app is very useful, and there's a lot of botanists that use it. All right, so we're at a good halfway point. Gia, are there any questions so far before we dive into the plants?
I haven't received any questions, not yet. So, but if anybody wants to post anything right now, we can just take a quick minute. But as of right now, We have one of our members who said that she's so excited, and but of course her kids flocked to her the moment you started speaking, which normally happens with kids, you know. But no, we don't have any questions just as of yet.
Perfect. And one thing I want to mention for those of you who are like, well, I don't live on a lake, or so how do I do aquatic gardening? A lot of these habitats can be found in roadside ditches. If you want a small little backyard pond, you just make your own. A pot with no drainage can be a great wetland pot. You can also do it in fountains. In fact, Miami has several public fountains that have been used as little wetlands in the middle of the city. So anywhere can be a wetland, and anywhere can be habitat. So everywhere should be native or edible plants. If it's not native and it's not edible, I want you to take a second and think, should I plant this, and what purpose does it have? If it's not benefiting the environment, or it's not benefiting, people eating food. But now let us dive in, if there are no questions, into the specific plants, which is why you all are here. It's the Native Plant Society. So the first one I want to talk about is the Asclepia perennis, the aquatic milkweed, host to the monarch queen and soldier butterflies, blooms and grows year-round with white flowers, mildly toxic like all milkweeds, on full sun if in water to full shade on land. And this is a theme we're going to see. A lot of aquatic plants, even some aquatic ferns or wetland ferns, can grow in more sun if they have more water, or become shade plants if on land. It's actually the water that's, once again, that limiting factor. And this is kind of one of the quirks with aquatic plants. And I'm not going to say the zone for each one of these plants, but I'll have it listed there. And then I'll also have some of the areas that they're native to if they have a specific region. And this one is a depth of 2 inches or less. So it's a riparian species. So I can ship fish and true aquatic plants to many areas in Florida. And this is one of the ones that I use a lot, because not only is it a terrestrial ground cover, but it's commonly used in the aquarium trade because it has 2 forms. On land, ground cover; underwater, it forms these towering little shrubs. And this is something you'll see with a lot of aquatic plants. Like cypress trees get knees in wetter areas. Many aquatic plants have multiple forms depending on the water level. And on land, they are eaten by the white peacock butterfly and are also a year-round pollinator plant. Their depth is shoreline, so in wet upland conditions, all the way to littoral areas, several feet deep. And they prefer full to part sun, though in the water they need clear water in order to grow into their shrub form. Bald cypress or pond cypresses, both are taxodiums and are very common. This is a host plant for the bald cypress sphinx moth, which is a very nice, beautiful moth. It's an aquatic tree that can be planted in littoral areas all the way to upland areas as a sapling. The deeper the water you put it in, the bigger the tree you want. And they're very tolerant of flooding. Obviously, they're cypress trees, and the seeds cannot be inundated for germination, though. So if you plant it deeper in the water, it might not send up new trees. It only reseeds in upland or riparian habitat. Cypress trees are one of the best trees to have for birds and waterfowl, because they're extremely, extremely good nesting sites, and they do have a lot of insects that use them, and they produce seeds. Ironically, they're native to almost all of Florida except the majority of Sarasota County, where if you actually look, except for extreme north and extreme south county and extreme east parts of the county, there are no old cypress stands. All the ones there have been planted, and historically they just didn't grow there, and we are not entirely sure why, but we think it has to do with just some of the geology of the area. Canna flaccida, or the golden canna lily, is a fan favorite to plant in aquatic areas. I put a star here because there were quite a few counties that were listing it as being able to grow in 18 inches of water. It cannot grow in 18 inches of water. It is a max depth of 6 inches and prefers riparian habitat. It is the host for the Brazilian skipper butterfly, which is a cute orangish brown skipper with a very ugly caterpillar. I think the caterpillar is hilariously ugly as it's clear and see-through, but I love them all the same. The seeds require an acid bath to properly germinate, but it's so easy to grow rhizomally. As you can see in the picture, they're just popping up everywhere. I actually got over 35 canna lilies in a single 4-month span from one starting lily. in the right conditions, they spread and grow like mad, and will even grow through the winter. And they love full sun. I recommend them in full sun to get all those flowers. So the mangrove spider lily is a very cool pollinator plant that can grow in full sun on a beach. It can grow in sand. It is often found on mangrove and spoil islands, and it's got beautiful, delicate flowers with this white texture. A lot of plants that are found along beaches do support at least one or two butterflies, and a lot of spider lilies are eaten by some generalist butterflies. So keep an eye out for that. They flower always in groups of 2 and are a very, very cool plant for South Florida, and they really like that coastal calcareous soil, not frost tolerant at all. So there are no water lilies that are host plants for butterflies or moths, but a lot of them can be pollinator plants. And they have the fragrant water lily, for example, the odoratas, have huge white fragrant flowers, hence the name. And they are beautiful, beautiful plants that help shade out algae below them. And they cool down the water and are great to help prevent algae blooms. In fact, I've never seen a lake with a lot of healthy lilies have routine algae problems. It's something that I don't see commonly, or at least a lot of the filamentous algae forms. They also are specifically attractive to gallinules and bass. Bass eat a lot of the worms that live in their roots, and gallinules and lilywalkers obviously walk across them with this kind of motion. This is for all the kids in the audience. And they're just very beautiful plants. And there's even some that are night bloomers. There's one that's a blue color morph, Nymphea elegans. And so there's a lot of different water lilies you can have in your lake. And they're beautiful, beautiful plants. Pickerel weed is a close relative of water hyacinth, and they get these big, beautiful purple flowers. They're excellent use for bees, and they're one of the most common and easy to grow pollinator plants. They can also grow in deep water, which is why you commonly see them in shoreline plantings. Remember what I was talking about earlier about how that shoreline dips very quickly? This is one of the few plants that can live in that dip, which is why you usually only see 3 species grown in most lakes: pickerel weed, duck potato, and Gulf spike rush, because they can survive there, not because they're the best plants for that. But it's a beautiful plant and also feeds a lot of waterfowl and turtles. Easily grown through cuttings and rhizomes. Not as easily through seed, but you can. One of my personal favorites, albeit a poisonous one, is the buttonbush. It's the host to the Titan sphinx and hydrangea sphinx moths. Huge, beautiful white and yellow flowers, just globe-like flowers. And they're very attractive to birds and mammals. They can tolerate a depth up to 2 inches, and they're riparian plants and also a part sun plant. Most aquatic plants prefer full sun, but these guys are a good alternative. So Florida is lucky enough to have several native hibiscus species. Scarlet hibiscus is the best South state species. So generally zones 8 through 11 is where it prefers. It's not, it doesn't like the cold, it dies back. And all the hibiscuses are hosts for many butterfly and moth species. So in addition to these big, beautiful flowers, you get a lot of butterflies and a lot of moths, including one of my favorites, which is the delightful bird dropping moth, which I thought was a hilarious name, so I made sure it was included. And they grow very well from cuttings or seed, so they're very useful to have. Hibiscus aculatus, or the Pineland hibiscus, is a much more north growing plant. It's kind of the opposite of the scarlet hibiscus. It likes to grow farther north, whereas the scarlet rose mallow hibiscus is more of the central Florida. So these 3 hibiscuses kind of form 3 distinct zones. And this one is actually somewhat cold tolerant. It's more cold tolerant. Like, it can survive a frost if it happens. So you see these guys a lot more in North Florida. And they're also shorter than Cochineus and the scarlet rose mallow. Sagittaria latifolia is very closely related to lancifolia, which is the deep water alternative here. And they both have similar flowers. These guys just have the lance-shaped leaves versus the arrowhead-shaped leaves. Both have very similar characteristics, except the Latifolia can only grow up to 6 inches deep in the water, whereas Lancifolia grow 2 feet. Latifolia is better at shading out algae, though, and is my preferred one to use, and it also encourages a lot of bird nesting, whereas Lancifolia has that much deeper alternative, and a fun fact, resists herbicide spraying. So a lot of lake managers throw these into lakes because they look nice and they resist herbicides. So they can spray glyphosate all over the lake and these guys are unaffected, which is kind of interesting, actually. You have to really spray these with heavy herbicides to kill them, but I don't recommend using any herbicides in your lake, or at least only using them to target the really harsh invasives like torpedo grass or Brazilian pepper, which are hard to remove otherwise. All Sagittarias, Lancifolia or Latifolia, are very attractive to birds and as a pollinator species. Believe it or not, the eel grass or tape grass does flower. It will send small white flowers up to the surface to be pollinated. And they have strong rhizomal growth and are very good at helping to clean the water and reduce erosion underwater, which can happen. They help stabilize the soil, are huge fish and waterfowl habitat, very, very important plants. And again, this goes into there can be habitat restoration everywhere. The lake doesn't just have plants along the shoreline or just in a littoral shelf. You want to plant the bottom of the lake. You want to have plants everywhere. And the depth that these can grow on is dependent on water clarity, and usually is a littoral plant. It'll grow in littoral, like deep littoral shelves or deep water. So some other non-flowering plants I wanted to touch on real quick are like horsetails, which are very useful for dry bioswales. They like to be occasionally inundated, but can tolerate dry conditions fairly well. You'll see them a lot in downtown Sarasota bioswales, actually. They're used commonly by cities. Canna species are large macroalgae that actually kill the small filamentous or plankton. And they suck up those nutrients and really clean up the water. They're useful to have if you have them in a lake, and I oftentimes do ship those out to people. Soft rush is a very interesting rush that likes muddy banks and soil, but can't tolerate being more than 2 inches deep. It's a very cool plant that produces lots of seeds for birds. Speaking of birds, giant bulrush, up to 12 feet tall, excellent bird habitat. I've seen sandhill cranes nest in them, ibis nests, lots of birds love them, and they eat the seeds as well. The white top sedge is great as a native plant border to ponds. It likes to have wet feet, helps to reduce erosion, and looks very nice, and it doesn't get very tall. It maxes out at about 12 inches tall. So, about this tall with very cool little white tops, can be mowed as well. So I like it as a native plant border. No-mow zones are often the border you see around lakes, but replace them with native plants. You're the Native Plant Society. Have us do native borders everywhere. Native plants everywhere. Get rid of your lawns. Plant more native plants. Giant leather fern is a really cool fern that actually can grow in full sun if it has enough water, but it prefers part sun to full shade and is one of the largest ferns in North America. I've seen them well over 12 feet tall. They are massive, massive ferns. And swamp fern is a smaller, shadier alternative that likes to be a little bit drier, but is still another good alternative for a fern. And last but not least is Gulf spikerush, Eleocharis interstincta on the left. It is one of the best erosion controls in lakes and ponds and can grow in a variety of depths, including very deep water, and is something I use quite often. It is also used as nesting material by quite a few birds. And now we get to go to the exciting, this is one of the most recent butterfly gardens we worked on. This is a floating butterfly garden for the Bay Project in Sarasota. As you can see, we start out with a mesh island, and the cool thing about a lot of these meshes is they're designed to grow for 20 years-ish, and they soak up heavy metals out of the water and it binds to the plastic, and then you dispose of the island to a landfill, but they remove a lot of heavy metals from the waterway. Some of these islands can even be recycled depending on what material you use. There's quite a few different designs and manufacturers. But I like this one because they specifically were having heavy metal issues in some of these waterways due to it being so close to so many roads and downtown areas, and they wanted to clean up the water, so we chose this design. You can also see we had crinum lilies growing on these islands. We had blue flag iris. We had several ground covers, bacopa and frog fruit, and we had scarlet hibiscus on these islands as well. They're currently still growing in. They don't look the best now that it's winter, but that's most gardens when a frost hits, and they look very, very nice. They also just, you don't have to water them after the first day or two because the island just soaks water up into it, and it floats there. As you can see, we had one of our good friends walk into the water to anchor it, but you all don't have to do that. You hire me to do that, and you don't have to get wet. And then you have a lovely island. And these are great for basking for birds, reptiles. A lot of fish actually lay their eggs on the undersides of the islands. And we recently finished a project up in another community where we found that if you put butterfly host plants on these islands, even in the middle of larger lakes, the butterflies still find them. And we had butterflies, the eggs, caterpillars, and chrysalis all survive on these islands. So they are functioning habitat, and we documented all of those. And you might be wondering, well, don't the caterpillars drown? I don't know if you all have ever seen, but a lot of caterpillars are really hard to get off the plants. And if they do fall down, the island usually is at most tiny, tiny bit underwater, and they can usually cling to something and get back up. So they are good habitat. And oh, you don't have to water it. You don't have to fertilize it. The only thing you have to do is occasionally weed it. And after you do that, well, the island is fairly self-sufficient. It's going to be taking nutrients up, putting it into the flowers on top, and either the butterflies come and eat the plants down and take the nutrients elsewhere in the form of butterflies, or you can harvest stuff on these islands. In fact, the Aztec Empire ran on these islands. They grew all the food for the great city of Tenochtitlan on chinchompas, which were their version of these islands. And they basically matted up huge amounts of organic material and grew them floating around the giant lake nearby. So these islands do work. You can feed an empire on them, or you can grow beautiful gardens. Everywhere and anywhere can be habitat, whether it's the middle of a lake to the top of a building with epiphytes and rooftop gardens. Everywhere should be habitat. We need to start thinking of it like that. I'm a habitat restoration professional, and there's nowhere I've ever seen that you can't have as habitat. So I just wanted to say thank you all for listening. It's been great. Here are some of the scientific references that I used throughout the talk. I am a scientist. I do love peer review. So now let's get to some questions. If you all have questions on particular plants, any want to talk about cool projects, or want to hear about how we fed rehab manatees in Bradenton, we can also talk about that as well. I have lots of fun stories that I love to talk about.
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah, we got a lot of questions come in right after we had a question break. They just started pouring in. So I was like, oh no, they just missed it. So we're going to get to everybody here, but we've got a lot. Let's see here. Okay, so the islands that you're talking about, so is it the plants that absorb the heavy metals? It's the mat itself? It's the way that the mat's designed?
It's both.
Okay.
So you can endlessly alter these islands. You can change the material the island's made out of. Some are completely inert. They don't affect the water at all. And those tend to be the ones that are more recyclable. But the ones that can help soak up heavy metals tend to be made out of porous plastic materials that we want the island to absorb the metals because we don't want the metals in the waterway.
Right.
You can also plant certain things on the island specifically to target certain things. So if you want more nutrient removal, you can do things like cattails or fire flag. Oh, fire flag is something I didn't put in the presentation. Wonderful aquatic plant. Also a host for the Brazilian skipper. Very cool plant. Check it out. Thalia geniculata. And so those are great at removing nitrogen and phosphorus. They're fast growing, big plants, easy to harvest. If you want heavy metal removal, there was a study done at New College of Florida, my alma mater, which looked into heavy metals and bioswales, and they found that a lot of the cord grasses were really good at removing them and sequestering them in the tops. So you can modify these islands to do different things. There was even a college that spelled out the name of their college using islands in a big lake.
What? That is so cool. That's awesome. Very cool. I'm so glad that you showed those because I know it wasn't in the original presentation, and I'm just so thrilled. It's such a cool idea. You know, I have my pond at home that I purchased fish from you for. I purchased shiners and flagfish and ghost shrimp, I think it was. And I've been dying to try the whole floating island thing in mine also. I mean, and you mentioned so many awesome things that I can identify issues with my pond now, like why I can't grow things, because I've got a very steep slope on one side where everything either dries out or it gets swallowed by the lake. So I have that issue also. And it's funny because the only thing that's really survived has been the pickerel weed. So that kind of makes sense now. So I want to get to some questions though, because we did have a lot come in. And Jamie Swindes, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced your last name, but she's asking where do you get the islands? Is this something that's available to the general public, or do we need to go through a company like yours in order to get them?
Generally, you do need to go through a company like mine. And be aware that the islands, while extremely useful and as a long-term solution, aren't just fire and forget. If you leave the islands alone for a few months, they might start getting trees growing on them, and those can rip the islands apart. But there is a wide variety of islands. Some are really small, like only this big, like little floating, like little pots, basically. And those are commercially available. But if you have a larger lake, I've actually had to order some islands. Like that one came from California. There are some local island makers, and it really depends on what you want. Some islands are much better at growing plants. Like you can actually use some of these islands as nurseries for certain species. And my company is actually working on growing more bog plants. And we might try some of them on these islands. So it really depends on what you want and the scale. But yes, Stocking Savvy is generally, I want you to buy from me. Shameless self-plug. I have a wide variety of network, and I already have a lot of this done. But you can do it yourself. And like if you have a tiny backyard pond, you can find them at most garden centers. And you can find like little planters sometimes that will just float in there. And again, plant native plants or edible plants. Elderberry, Canna indica, and several taro species are all edible. However, be careful with taro as it's invasive.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that I've been trying in my yard is, you know, because just to kind of see how it works, but I wasn't able to plant water lilies because of the same rise and fall issue. Like, you know, I can't really quite get it deep enough to where I would have to like figure out how to get in the water, I guess. But whenever the water came way up after I planted water lilies, it swallowed them and they never came back. So it's interesting that you say that they can go 8 to 13 feet. I think they should have been okay. But I actually tried to do a little floating thing myself where I took a bottle, sealed it with silicone, sealed the cap with silicone, and then made like that as a float. I had a hanging basket come from that for my water lily, so it can go up and down with the water level. And it's actually been working so far. But if anybody wanted to try stuff on their own, I mean, you might be able to make some sort of contraption with sealed water bottles, or who knows.
So a great trick that I learned from botanical gardens actually is that because, especially if you have a very shallow lake, you know, they'll cover the entire lake if it's shallow enough. But if you want water lilies and you want that very important habitat, but you don't want them to cover the entire lake and you can't afford to dig out the center, is to use weighted pots. And they grow mostly rhizomally, so they won't grow out of the pot. And then you can place the pots where you want and just have beautiful water lilies. And I actually helped do that for several areas. Turtles ate some of them in some of the areas, but others look great.
That's awesome. Very cool. All right. So let's see what else we have here in the way of questions. So Jamie's also asking if the presentation will be available later on PDF. Do you plan on making that available, or I don't know if you would like to make a PDF available? Or we do have the recording on Cuplet Fern though also.
If you have the recording, that's generally easiest. A lot of the stuff is also on my website, stockingsavvy.com, where we're always uploading new stuff. We're very active on social media, so you'll find a lot of this there. And also just, you know, watch the recording as well. I'm working on getting more materials out to the public by working with journals to publish. So always stay tuned. You can follow us at Stocking Savvy on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and obviously just through our website.
Absolutely. So I have a comment from Lorraine. I don't know if you can see these if you're looking at the screen here. Lorraine is okay, cool. She's asking if there's any invasive reeds here in Florida that you know about.
So real quick to clarify, there's a difference between something that grows fast and a lot and an invasive species. Cattails, for instance, are mostly native species, but they obviously can take over large areas. That does not make them an invasive species. As far as invasive reeds go, the most common one that I see in South Florida or Florida is papyrus, actually, from Egypt. As far as up north in Michigan, I don't know for sure, but I'd bet. I know Michigan has dealt with water hyacinth in the past. It acts as an annual up there. So there's always a chance.
Do you see the dwarf papyrus or like the bigger?
The full size species. I've seen some dwarfs, but they tend not to spread as much. And again, it's so much harder to do invasive species management. So grow natives, and even some of the natives might get big. So be prepared.
So a neighbor of mine, I think it was before she got the house, but somebody had planted the dwarf papyrus in their yard, and it's commonly sold in the nursery trade as, you know, a water garden plant. And that thing has spread almost all over every wet area in her yard, including the ditches up front, and she's got like 5 acres, so it's gone everywhere. So it was kind of surprising to see. So even if it's not listed as an invasive, I mean, it really kind of went crazy. I think it is a category 2, if I'm not mistaken. It might be. I can't remember off the top of my head. But yeah, those non-native aquatic plants, especially, like, that's bad news. Some of them could just really get super out of control. You know, elephant ear, I see people plant that a lot, like the big elephant ear you see everywhere in Florida. That's a bad one.
They're all. If look to the FLEPC list for species that are known invasives, and again, this is why it's just so much easier to stay towards the natives. I love the Florida IFAS office, but every year 5 of their Florida-friendly plants end up on invasive species lists. Florida has 2,000 plus native species, 400 found nowhere else on Earth. Why do you want your yard to look the same as New York? Exactly. Gosh, you have a unique we have several unique ecosystems down here. Like, look to Man in the Ground as a wonderful, cool native vine, or Hercules club trees if you want a tree that's all spikes and will numb your mouth if you eat it. These are amazing plants. Put them in your yards and your landscapes.
Absolutely. Totally agree. Absolutely. I've got, let me see, where was it? Oh, I just lost. Jamie's asking again, best plant for drastic water level fluctuations. I think he went over that in the presentation, which Pickerel Weed is one, and didn't you say Sagittarius another one?
So big water levels, you basically have to plan for the deepest areas. So Pickerel Weed, Pickerel Weed, Sagittaria lancifolia, the duck potato, Gulf spike rush, Eleocara interstincta, and cypress trees are all really good at fluctuating water levels. I've also noticed firefly can handle quite a bit as well, but it's not as good. And I know specifically you're going to want to look for plants that do well in cypress swamps, because some cypress swamps do have 20-foot shifts in water. It's very, very drastic.
All right. Awesome. We got one from Lindsay Johnson. I live in a drainage canal that goes to the Indian River Lagoon. It has a regular flow to the lagoon. It is generally freshwater. Can I put a floating butterfly island in it?
You could. There's just a few things you might want to double check. One is if it's a drainage canal, if it rains, how strong is the water? Is it going to push your island away? You need to make sure you have a good, strong anchor on that. 2, since it is next to a lagoon, during the dry season, you might get saltwater intrusion. Thankfully, quite a few plants are salt tolerant. Golden canna lilies, spider lilies, crinum lilies all have a degree of salt tolerance, as do many of our rushes. Black needle rush, for example, is a specifically estuarine rush. So you can. My worry about that would mostly be logistical. It might be easier to do shoreline plantings instead, just because, you know, if you have a drainage canal, water can move fast. So be careful with that.
That's a really good point. Probably a point that, I mean, I wouldn't have thought of that. That's a very good point there. I have, let me see here. Can all canna lilies grow in water, from Diana? Diana, we're talking about native canna in this presentation, and the native canna does. Canna flaccida, I think it is, if I'm saying it right. I don't think there's any other native cannas. Is there?
There is.
Is there?
So there are actually two that I work with extensively. Canna flaccida, also known as golden canna, generally likes riparian habitat. So it likes maximum 6 inches of water to just having wet feet. Canna indica is a slightly more upland. It's also known as the Seminole canna lily. It's more of a central Florida plant, gets more orange flowers, has edible roots, and prefers more of the upland riparian border. It's a little more drought tolerant of a plant, but I've also seen grow alongside lake edges. That's more of a specialty plant that's a little harder to find, but both are great plants to have in a lake or wetland.
Very cool. Okay, I thought we only had the golden one. That's awesome. I'm cannas. Whenever I was more into traditional gardening, cannas was my absolute favorite, and I used to have all the exotic varieties and everything. And then when I kind of switched over to native gardening, I was kind of sad to learn that a lot of them aren't native. But of course, I've got the yellow one like all over my yard because it's just absolutely gorgeous. So I'm really excited to hear that there's another one. I'm going to have to look into that some more. Evelyn has, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, there's a ton of different really cool wetland species, and a big project I'm working on is trying to introduce more. And so again, if people are looking to stay in touch, look at what we're doing, look up stockingsavvy.com. We have a newsletter on the front page. Feel free to email us, stockingsavvy@gmail.com. Call us 941-500-2218. And feel free to just reach out to us. We have a lot of social media, and we're trying to do habitat restoration everywhere. And we do projects all over Florida.
Very cool. So Evelyn has another question for us. So Evelyn is asking about goldfish in ponds, but Evelyn, we're talking about native species in this presentation. Goldfish are not exactly native. Goldfish come from carp, which I don't know if there's any native carp, but that's kind of going, you know. Oh, go ahead.
So goldfish I don't generally recommend for a few reasons. One is they're not native. Two is they actually prefer cooler water, and a lot of them are grown in Mexico, actually, in some deep, cool water pools. But because a lot of Florida waters are just shallow and warm, they tend to not live as long. They tend to have more health issues. And we also have so many native, carnivores that sometimes I've seen entire ponds get fished out by bright goldfish. There's quite a few different native species to replace them with, including some other carps. So like there's golden shiners, chub suckers, don't laugh at that. There's Florida flagfish, which are very funny. And, they look like an American flag. We even started stocking gar and bowfin, which are some really cool native fish species that are big territorial hunters. There's bream and bass and dozens of little swamp darters, and you can even get the Florida crayfish, which has an electric blue variant where it's bright blue and looks like an electric guitar. There's a lot of cool stuff you can put in, and goldfish is just kind of scratching the surface. And it's not like I don't like goldfish. I mean, I've had them before, but they're more of a colder water fish, and Florida's just kind of hot and soupy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan. I've been a goldfish hobbyist for years, so I've kept them and some of I would not put them in I have a large actual pond in my yard. I would not put them in there, but a small container, or not a small container. I mean, large, for a pond, but I think I have one that's like maybe a 50-gallon container that I have one goldfish in. And the thing is, they produce a lot of ammonia also. They are very kind of dirty fish that need, if you have like a small pond, they need a pretty substantial filter to kind of take care of their ammonia load. So, I mean, it's for those kind of ponds, you just kind of got to think about all that also. But yeah.
Never put in non-native fish. We're actually having huge issues with invasive species in Florida. Tilapia, for instance, there was a big scientific study on them because they were stocked everywhere to try to reduce algae blooms. It turns out they eat all the native fish, native invertebrates, and native plants first, and then they try to start filtering algae. But because everything else dies, they go away too. And so keep it to native plants, keep it to native fish. And I just saw someone say, did I miss brackish loving natives for butterflies? Crinum lilies, mangroves are perfect. Mangroves have their own skipper butterfly. And also several of the thorny plants like, one of my favorites is knicker nut. And it's the host plant for the Cassius blue. Very spiny though. So if you have kids that you don't like, plant it. I have a 3 foot deep by 15 by 5 foot pond. So basically, if this is kind of a general question, if you see a lake or an area that has a lot of muck and detritus and goo and poop, you want detritivores. So detritivores are a group of fish and inverts that clean up the muck on the bottom. And so a lot of these can be like crayfish, grass shrimp, golden shiners, things like that, the kind of cleaning crew of a lake. And so again, you want multiple methods of dealing with detritus. Plants also produce a lot of detritus, but they'll clean up some too. So it's a double-edged sword there, but you want things that'll help filter it out. A lot of companies will try to sell you a bacteria. Those have mixed results. And oftentimes you can do things to prevent the need for that by just having native species in place.
Right, absolutely. So before you get to, I know that Matthew Hopkins asked another question down here, but we've got one from earlier that I kind of want to make sure we get to her. Let's see. Lorraine, she's asking, without nasty herbicides, how best to remove wetland invasive plants?
It depends on the species. So some wetland plants can actually be removed by native fish. I did a lot of studies looking at how to reduce algae growth with, like the flagfish and carps, and some like hydrilla, which is a really nasty invasive plant, aren't eaten by any natives. So we'd had to use genetically modified sterile grass carp, and those have been very effective at reducing herbicides. Or I set up a plant recycling project with the Sarasota County and the Bishop Museum, where they fed invasive species to manatees, because manatees also live in South America, where they eat a lot of these aquatic invasive plants. So we got to feed manatees in captivity, reduce invasive plants, and help the environment. But some invasive plants like torpedo grass and Brazilian pepper have no controls like that. We have to use herbicides, but it's different than just spraying everything with Roundup, when you could use something like Tiger, which only kills torpedo grass. It doesn't affect any other aquatic plants nearby. It does kill lawn grass though, but who wants a lawn anyway? And then there's Brazilian pepper, which you have to cut down and spray the stump or spray the trunk of the tree.
Yes, absolutely. Sometimes it's unavoidable, unfortunately. Yeah.
It really depends.
I've got a lot of experience with that. You can't just cut it down unless you remove the whole thing by the roots. If you can't get the whole Brazilian pepper tree by the roots, it's going to come back, and it's going to come back fierce. So herbicide is it's absolutely necessary. So Matthew, he was also asking where to get these fish. So, Sean was saying he sells a lot of them. Some of them I think you can get from pet stores sometimes, like flagfish I've heard is sometimes sold at pet stores. But it might, be kind of a challenge to find some of them unless you order it from somebody. So, but Sean could help with that.
I work with several fish growers. Some of them I work with are like simple mom and pop ones. Some of them are from larger scale habitat restoration and fish growing facilities. Some fish like bream and bass have different regulations, so I have to work with local providers to get those to you. Others like the flagfish, the shiners, the shrimp, the crayfish, gar, amia, and a smattering of others, and some aquatic plants, I can ship directly to your house, as long as they're native. I cannot ship non-natives. I do not do that. I can only do habitat restoration. Otherwise, I have a $25,000 fine. So
wow.
I only do natives. And so that would be something where just go to my website or give me a call, stockingsavvy.com, and we can get you these species to do habitat restoration. I do have a $200 minimum order. So because I do work on wholesale. So if you have like a little 60-gallon pond, there's a lot of stuff you can put in there. And we could either really trick it out with a lot of different cool fish and plants and stuff, Or if you're like, I don't know if I need $200 worth for this small pond, get some neighbors. You
Yes.
can do all sorts of stuff. Work with your neighbors. In fact, I've had some communities where everyone wants to do habitat restoration, and I've had entire HOAs, entire communities, entire watersheds switch to natives. And you can do native plantings in the yards, in the ditches, in the lakefronts, even on rooftops and gardens. And there's all sorts of stuff you can do. If you're doing rooftop gardens, consult an architect first. Don't just start putting plants up there. But there's all sorts of things you can do to restore habitat. I've even seen endangered species in my yard. And my yard used to have no plants, none. And now I'm getting endangered mallow scrub hair streaks, spicebush swallowtails, all sorts of cool birds, and a very cute barn cat. And it's all sorts of wonderful stuff. And the habitats really come back. And that's what I want you all to take away from this. Habitat restoration anywhere, everywhere. Talk to your neighbors and show them some of these plants. If scarlet hibiscus is one of the largest natural hibiscuses in the world and is bigger than most cultivated ones. If a flower bigger than your head doesn't convince people, talk about the butterflies, the bees, get people out there. And a lot of this stuff is only a few hundred to a few $1,000s for entire communities. And some of these things like living shorelines are far cheaper than seawalls or riprap. The environmental choice is the financial choice in a lot of cases, and you just help restore the world and fight climate change and red tide. So go out there and fix the environment. There's never an opportunity not to improve a habitat or a lake and restore more native species and get the diversity out there. We've even started working on getting native orchids and air plants back into trees in communities. So there's always something you can do, and Stalking Savvy is here to help.
Amazing, Sean. That was super inspiring. I love that. So I think we're going to take just one more question here. I think we pretty much got everyone. I think Sean answered your question, Matthew, about the 60-gallon pond. So I think, yeah, going in with some neighbors on order would probably be a good idea. Let's see here. So let's just take Kate's question. We got to wrap this up because we're over an hour now. So Kate is saying, I've got lots and lots of mosquito fish in the pond. So would that need to be balanced with crayfish, I guess, if they'll eat it? Or would it be an issue with too many mosquito fish?
So here's the thing with ponds. Currently, mosquito fish are the only thing you're required to put in a pond, and that's because they eat mosquitoes. Well, if you're dealing with, detritus, you could work on getting some crayfish, some little shrimp, maybe some flagfish, because what happens is there's a cycle. Or if you have, say, you have detritus and you have things eat all that and they poop it into the water, that might start forming an algae bloom. And if you don't have anything that eats algae, you're going to start getting algae issues. And say, you put something in that eats the algae, then it might move into something else. So you want to have a variety of herbivores and detritivores to preempt a lot of these issues, multiple modes of biological control. And that's kind of what I would recommend. So like for your lake, just as or your pond as an example, get 3 to 5 crayfish, because it's not, it's a 3 foot deep, 15 by 5. Oh, you could get 20 crayfish, 50 flagfish, maybe some shiners, though those have a big minimum order, and you might want to work with someone else to get them. Gia knows that I have to sell them by hundreds a piece. And, maybe you could get even some bullfrogs. A lot of amphibians are really important in these lake ecosystems, and a lake in a pond that big might even be able to support a gar or some bream or a bit bigger of a fish. I've seen some gar in absolutely tiny water bodies as fat, healthy, beautiful little gators. And there's all sorts of things you can do, and I'm constantly working to expand the diversity of species. In fact, I can even now start stocking bullfrogs, leopard frogs, and peepers, which are adorable.
Very cool. That's awesome. Very cool. All right. I mean, gosh, we had so many amazing questions during this webisode. I thank everyone for joining us, and thank you, Sean, for the absolutely amazing presentation. So, of course, everything that you guys have learned today, Sean can kind of help you out with any questions that you have about that, or if you would like to hire somebody to install plants or anything in your pond, please feel free to reach out to Sean. And yeah, we'll go ahead and we'll close out this presentation, but thank you guys. This was fantastic.
And thank you again for having me, Gia. I love the enthusiasm to help restore the environment, to grow native species and support native plants and pollinators. And again, if anyone ever needs help with this, I specialize in aquatics, but my company does habitat restoration of all kinds. StockingSavvy.com. Feel free to go there, learn more about me, and I can do projects all over Florida, even if it's just shipping you some fish. That's fine. So feel free to give me a call, an email, and let's go out there and fix Florida. Hoorah!
All right. Bye, guys.